You're born into a world where winter doesn't just mean cold weather and hot cocoa. It means potential starvation, watching your family slowly weaken, and the very real possibility that spring might arrive too late to save you. Welcome to medieval food storage, where your survival depends on outsmarting time itself. No refrigerators, no grocery stores, no magical preservatives that keep food fresh for decades. Just you, your wits, and 15 incredible foods that laugh in the face of expiration dates. But here's what's absolutely mind-blowing about medieval peasants. They weren't just lucky survivors. They were food preservation geniuses who developed stockpiling strategies so effective that some of their techniques are still used by preppers and survival experts today. They turned the science of not dying into an art form. The life or death game of medieval food storage. You learn early that food preservation isn't a hobby. It's literally the difference between living and dying. Medieval peasants faced a brutal reality. Harvest season might give you abundance for a few months, but the other 9 months of the year, you better hope you stored enough, stored it right, and stored it smart. Medieval food science was basically a continuous experiment in defying nature. Every technique, every storage method, every carefully hoarded grain was a gamble against time, pests, moisture, and the countless other forces trying to turn your winter survival stash into a moldy, rotten mess. Your medieval ancestors understood something we've largely forgotten. Food that lasts forever isn't science fiction, it's science fact. They stockpiled 15 specific foods that could survive years, even decades, without spoiling. These weren't just random choices. They were calculated decisions based on centuries of trial, error, and occasionally spectacular failure. Food number 1, hardtack, the indestructible bread. You start with the king of survival foods, hardtack. This isn't bread as you know it. This is edible concrete, a mixture of flour, water, and salt baked into biscuits so hard they could probably stop arrows. And that's exactly the point. Hardtack was made by machine and could survive rough handling and temperature extremes. When properly stored and transported, hardtack biscuits were baked hard and would stay intact for years if kept dry. For long voyages, hardtack was baked 4 times rather than the more common 2 and prepared 6 months before sailing. Medieval peasants didn't call it hardtack, that's a later term. They called it ship's bread, hard bread, or simply biscuit. But whatever they called it, they understood its incredible power. Properly made hardtack could last decades. The oldest verified piece of hardtack in existence was baked in 1851 and is still technically edible today. You make hardtack by mixing flour and water into a stiff dough, rolling it flat, cutting it into squares, and poking holes in it with a nail or stick. Then you bake it at high heat until it's completely dried out. The result looks like a rectangular cracker and feels like a piece of wood. Hardtack has been around for thousands of years and was often eaten by Roman legionaries when on campaign. The soldiers would cook their wheat rations into hardtack, a long-lasting biscuit that composed roughly 60 to 70% of a soldier's total rations. The genius of hardtack isn't just its longevity, it's its versatility. You can't eat it dry without risking your teeth, but soak it in water, milk, soup, or even wine, and it becomes edible. It absorbs flavors, provides carbohydrates and protein, and can be turned back into flour if you grind it up. It's like having a time-release bread that activates whenever you need it. Medieval families would bake massive batches during harvest time when fuel was plentiful and grain was available. They'd store it in dry places, protected from moisture and rodents. A well-stocked family might have hundreds of hardtack biscuits stored away, enough calories to sustain them through the worst winters. Food number 2, honey, nature's perfect preservative. You discover that honey isn't just sweet, it's basically liquid immortality. Honey and sugar were both excellent natural preservatives used to prevent food spoilage. Fruits were often stored in honey or cooked with sugar and sealed in jars to make jams and jellies. Honey has been found in Egyptian tombs after thousands of years, still perfectly edible. Medieval peasants knew this. They understood that honey doesn't just last forever. It actively preserves other foods. You could submerge fruits, nuts, even small pieces of meat in honey, and they'd stay fresh for years. The reason honey never spoils is pure chemistry, though medieval folks didn't understand the science. Honey has incredibly low water content and high acidity. Bacteria and other microorganisms simply can't survive in it. It's like nature designed the perfect food preservative and then made it delicious. Medieval beekeeping was serious business. Monasteries often maintained large apiaries because honey was essential for both preservation and as the primary sweetener before sugar became available. A single productive hive could provide enough honey to preserve a family's fruit harvest and sweeten their food through the winter. You learned to use honey strategically. Fresh apples dipped in honey and sealed in jars could last through winter. Honey-preserved nuts provided protein and fat during lean times. Even bread spread with honey lasted longer than plain bread because the honey created a barrier against mold and bacteria. But honey wasn't just a preservative, it was medicine. Medieval people knew that honey could treat wounds, soothe coughs, and provide quick energy. A jar of honey was like having a pharmacy, pantry, and preservative factory all in one. Food number 3, salt, the white gold of preservation. You come to understand why salt was literally worth its weight in silver. Salt was the most common way to preserve virtually any type of meat or fish, as it drew out moisture and killed bacteria. Salting was used because most bacteria, fungi, and other potentially pathogenic organisms cannot survive in a highly salty environment. Medieval peasants turned salt preservation into an art form. They created salt pork, salt beef, and salt fish that could last for years. Salting was common and even culinary by choosing raw salts from different sources: rock salt, sea salt, spiced salt. In the 1800s, it was discovered that certain sources of salt gave meat a red color instead of the usual unappetizing gray. You mastered different salting techniques. Dry salting involved covering meat or fish completely in coarse salt, which drew out all moisture. Brining meant soaking food in heavily salted water. Both methods created environments so hostile to bacteria that food could survive indefinitely if kept dry. The process wasn't just about dumping salt on food. You learned to butcher animals in autumn when they're fattest. Immediately salt the meat in specific patterns to ensure even preservation, and then store it in wooden barrels or hang it in dry, cool places. Properly salted pork could feed a family through multiple winters. Salt preservation came with trade-offs. The food became incredibly salty, much saltier than anything you'd eat today. Medieval cooks developed elaborate techniques for removing excess salt before cooking. Multiple soakings, adding sweet ingredients, using spices to mask the saltiness. It was food preservation at the cost of flavor, but when the alternative was starvation, that was an easy choice. Medieval salt was expensive and precious. Peasants might spend weeks' wages on enough salt to preserve their autumn slaughter. But it was an investment in survival. A few pounds of salt could turn a single pig into months of protein. Food number 4, stockfish, the original freeze-dried protein. You learn about one of the most ingenious preservation methods ever developed, stockfish. The drying of food is the world's oldest known preservation method, and dried fish has a storage life of several years. Stockfish is cured in a fermentation process where cold-adapted bacteria matures the fish, similar to the maturing process of cheese. Stockfish wasn't just dried fish, it was a precisely controlled preservation process. The fish is gutted and the head removed, then hung on wooden racks for 3 months in cold winter winds. After that, they are hard as rock and very easy to transport and store for years. To eat stockfish, you first need to keep it in water for 3 to 5 days. This product accounted for most of Norway's trade income from the Viking Age throughout the medieval period. Preserved cod fed Iceland for centuries, to the extent that it has been described as a local equivalent of bread. The genius of stockfish was that it turned fish, one of the most perishable foods, into something that could outlast empires. Medieval traders carried stockfish across Europe. It was protein you could store for years, transport anywhere, and prepare whenever needed. You discover that making stockfish required perfect conditions. A temperature just above 0 degrees Celsius with little rain is ideal. Too much frost will spoil the fish, as ice destroys the fibers in the fish. During the drying, About 80% of the water in the fish evaporates. Medieval coastal communities built their entire economies around stockfish. Fishing villages would catch cod during spawning season, then spend months drying and preparing it for trade. A successful stockfish operation could provide a community's entire income for the year. The preparation was labor-intensive but straightforward. Fresh cod was gutted immediately after catching, hung on special wooden racks called yell, and left to dry in the cold air for months. The result was fish so hard it could be used as lumber, but so nutritious it could sustain entire populations through famines. Food number 5, dried beans and legumes. The protein powerhouses. You realize that beans aren't just food, they're survival insurance. Various legumes such as chickpeas, fava beans, and field peas were common and important sources of protein, especially among the lower classes. Dried peas and lentils and chickpeas and beans would last as well as grain. Medieval peasants stockpiled multiple varieties of dried legumes because they understood nutritional diversity. 60 pounds of dry legumes per person per year is a good estimate for longer-term food storage. Legumes are nutrient-dense and are a good source of fiber, protein, iron, calcium, zinc, B vitamins, and are naturally low in fat. In the Middle Ages, peas were a staple of the European diet, alongside grains and beans. Often dried for storage, they became a vital resource during famines and lean seasons. Hot mashed peas were sold on the streets and distributed as charitable pittances to the poor outside convents. You learn that different legumes serve different purposes. Peas were the most common, easy to grow and quick to cook. Lentils provided variety and cooked without soaking. Fava beans, broad beans, were hearty and filling. Chickpeas, when available, added different flavors and textures. The preservation process was beautifully simple. After harvesting, you'd spread beans and peas on cloths to dry completely in the sun. Once thoroughly dried, they could be stored in sealed containers for years. Dried beans and lentils can have a shelf life of up to 25 years if processed correctly. Medieval legume storage was an art. You'd layer dried beans with aromatic herbs to repel insects, store them in sealed pottery vessels or wooden chests, and keep them in the driest part of your home. Properly stored beans could last through multiple bad harvests, providing protein when meat was scarce or unaffordable. The nutritional wisdom was profound. Beans combined with grains create complete proteins, something medieval peasants understood intuitively. A meal of bread and beans provided all the amino acids needed for survival, which is why this combination appears in cuisines around the world. Food number 6, dried grains, the foundation of life. You understand that grains aren't just food, they're civilization itself. Grains like rye and wheat were dried in the sun or air before being stored in a dry place. Wheat and other cereals could keep up to 4 years as long as they were dry and stored with their hulls intact in silos carved out of bedrock. Medieval grain storage was serious infrastructure. Grain storage is usually in a tower-like silo or other granary. Flour by itself doesn't keep very well, but whole grains with hulls intact could be stored for years. You learn that different grains serve different purposes and have different storage lives. Wheat was the premium grain, used for the best bread, but it was often too expensive for peasants. Barley was hearty and made decent beer and porridge. Oats were filling and nutritious. Rye grew in poor soil and cold climates where wheat couldn't survive. The key to grain storage was keeping them whole and dry. Grain, of course, can be stored without refrigeration and will last quite well if the mice and rats don't get into it. Medieval people stored grains in dry places, often in specially constructed granaries or stone silos. Medieval granaries were marvels of engineering. Stone silos carved into bedrock, elevated wooden granaries designed to keep out rodents, sealed pottery vessels that could hold a family's grain supply. The wealthy built elaborate storage towers. Peasants made do with sealed chests and careful attention to moisture. You develop techniques for protecting stored grain. Aromatic herbs repel insects. Ash layers prevent moisture. Regular inspection catches problems early. Some families stored grain in multiple small containers rather than one large one. If pests got into one batch, the others remained safe. The psychological aspect was crucial. Medieval peasants lived with the constant knowledge that their grain stores were literally their lifeline. Running low on grain meant potential starvation. Successful grain storage meant survival, so every technique was carefully passed down through generations. Food number 7. Cheese. The milk that lasts. You discover that cheese is basically milk's immortal cousin. Milk was fermented and curdled into a multitude of cheeses or buttermilk. The majority of the European population lived in rural communities where dairy preservation was essential. Medieval cheesemaking turned a highly perishable product, milk, into something that could last months or even years. Hard cheeses, properly aged and stored, became valuable commodities that could be traded, stored, and consumed long after the cows that produced the original milk had died. You learn that different cheeses have different storage lives. Fresh cheeses needed to be eaten quickly, but hard cheeses aged for months became increasingly valuable. The longest-lasting cheeses were often coated in wax, wrapped in cloth, or stored in cool caves where they continued to age and develop flavor. The process was complex but reliable. Milk was cultured with specific bacteria, curdled with rennet, pressed to remove whey, and then aged under carefully controlled conditions. Medieval cheesemakers understood that the right bacteria could preserve milk almost indefinitely, while the wrong conditions could ruin months of work. Medieval monasteries became cheese-making centers because they had the infrastructure for long-term storage and the patience for extended aging processes. Monks developed many of the great European cheeses that are still made today using essentially the same medieval techniques. Storage required specific conditions: cool temperatures, proper humidity, protection from pests, and regular monitoring. Medieval cheese storage rooms were carefully designed to maintain consistent conditions year-round. A well-managed cheese store could provide protein and fat through the longest winters. Food number 8. Rendered animal fats. Liquid gold. You learn that fat isn't just food, it's a preservation system. Another method was to seal the food by cooking it in honey, sugar, or fat, in which it was then stored. Confits were most usually made from fowl or pork, where meat was salted and cooked for a very long time in its own fat. Rendered animal fats, lard from pigs, tallow from cattle and sheep, could last for years without refrigeration. Medieval peasants rendered fat from every animal they butchered, storing it in sealed containers for cooking, preservation, and even lighting. To make a confit, the meat was salted and cooked for a very long time in its own fat, then allowed to cool in its own fat. It was then sealed up in its own fat and stored in a cool place, where it could last for months. You master the art of fat rendering. When butchering animals in autumn, every scrap of fat was carefully collected and slowly cooked down until it became liquid. This liquid fat was then strained and stored in sealed pottery vessels or wooden containers. Properly rendered fat remained stable for years. The uses were endless. Fat preserved meat through the confit process. It provided cooking oil when olive oil was unavailable or expensive. It could be made into candles for lighting. Mixed with herbs, it became medicinal salves. In extreme cold, it provided concentrated calories for survival. Medieval fat storage required attention to detail. The rendering process had to be complete. Any remaining water or impurities would cause spoilage. The storage containers had to be completely clean and well sealed. The fat had to be kept cool and protected from light and air. The nutritional value was crucial. In a world where calories were often scarce, fat provided the most concentrated energy available. A small amount of stored fat could turn bland grains and vegetables into satisfying, nourishing meals that provided the energy needed for hard physical labor. Food number 9, vinegar, the sour preserver. You discover that vinegar isn't just for salads. It's a preservation powerhouse. Pickling was another common preservation technique, using vinegar instead of brine. Vinegar, made through fermentation, acted as an effective preservative for vegetables, eggs, and other foods. Medieval vinegar was made from wine, beer, or fermented fruit juices. The acetic acid in vinegar created an environment where harmful bacteria couldn't survive. making it perfect for preserving foods that would otherwise spoil quickly. Vegetables, eggs, or fish were often pickled in tightly packed jars containing brine and acidic liquids, including lemon juice, verjuice, or vinegar. You learned to make vinegar from leftover wine or beer that had gone sour. Medieval households often maintained vinegar barrels where they could add wine dregs, spoiled beer, or fruit scraps. The vinegar mother, a culture of bacteria, would convert the alcohol into acetic acid, creating a preservative that could last indefinitely. The pickling process became essential for vegetable preservation. Cabbage pickled in vinegar became sauerkraut. Onions, beets, and other vegetables could be preserved in vinegar brines. Even eggs could be preserved in vinegar for months, providing protein when fresh eggs weren't available. Medieval vinegar storage was straightforward but important. Vinegar needed to be kept in non-reactive containers, pottery or wood, never metal, which would corrode. The containers needed to be sealed but able to breathe slightly as vinegar continued to develop over time. The medicinal uses were equally important. Vinegar was used to treat wounds, aid digestion, and preserve medicinal herbs. Four Thieves vinegar, vinegar infused with protective herbs, was believed to prevent plague and other diseases. Food number 10. Dried fruits. Nature's candy that lasts. You learn that fruit doesn't have to be seasonal if you know how to dry it properly. Fruits were sun-dried in warmer climes and oven-dried in cooler regions. Fruits were popular and could be served fresh, dried, or preserved, and were a common ingredient in many cooked dishes. Medieval fruit drying was both art and science. Fruits were often dried, but a far more tasty method of preserving them past their season was to seal them up in honey. You master different drying techniques depending on your climate and resources. In sunny regions, fruits were laid out on cloths or wooden racks to dry in the sun. In cooler climates, fruits were dried near fires or in bread ovens after the day's baking was done. The process required careful attention. Fruits had to be prepared properly. Apples and pears were sliced, grapes were left whole or halved, plums were pitted. They needed to be dried completely to prevent spoilage, but not so much that they became inedible. Dried fruits provided essential nutrients during winter months when fresh fruit was unavailable. They contained concentrated sugars for energy, vitamins that helped prevent scurvy and other deficiency diseases, and fiber for digestion. A handful of dried fruit could provide quick energy for hard work. Storage was critical. Dried fruits had to be completely moisture-free and stored in sealed containers with aromatic herbs to repel insects. Some medieval families stored dried fruits in honey or fat for extra preservation. Properly dried and stored fruits could last for years. The versatility was remarkable. Dried fruits could be eaten as snacks, cooked into porridges and stews, ground into pastes for sweetening, or reconstituted with water for cooking. They were concentrated nutrition that could be stored compactly and transported easily. Food number 11. Nuts in shells, natural storage containers. You realize that nuts are basically nature's pre-packed survival food. Nuts in their shells could last for years without any special preservation techniques. The shell provided natural protection against moisture, pests, and spoilage. Medieval nut gathering was a crucial autumn activity. Walnuts, hazelnuts, chestnuts, and almonds were collected and stored in their shells in dry places. Unlike many other foods, nuts required no processing, no special techniques, no expensive preservatives, just dry storage. The nutritional value was exceptional. Nuts provided fats, proteins, and calories in a concentrated, shelf-stable form. A handful of nuts could provide the energy equivalent of a full meal, making them perfect for travel, emergency rations, or supplementing lean winter diets. You learn to assess nut quality before storage. Good nuts felt heavy for their size and didn't rattle when shaken. Damaged shells were removed immediately to prevent spoilage from spreading. The best nuts were stored in wooden chests or pottery vessels, layered with aromatic herbs to repel insects. Medieval nut storage was remarkably simple. Keep them dry, keep them cool, keep them away from rodents. Nuts stored in their shells in consistent conditions could remain edible for years. Some varieties, like walnuts, actually improved with age as their oils mellowed. The versatility made nuts invaluable. They could be eaten raw as snacks, ground into pastes for cooking, pressed for oil, or added to other preserved foods for flavor and nutrition. Chestnuts could even be ground into flour for bread making when grain was scarce. Food number 12. Salt pork, the meat that lasts forever. You discover that salt pork isn't just preserved meat, it's a culinary foundation that could sustain entire communities through winter. Salted meat was a staple of the mariner's diet in the Age of Sail. It was stored in barrels and often had to last for months at sea. Instructions for preserving freshly killed venison in the 14th century involved boiling in brine and dry salting for long-term preservation in a barrel. Medieval salt pork was made during autumn slaughter time when pigs were fattest. The entire process was carefully timed and executed. Pigs were butchered in cold weather to prevent spoilage, immediately butchered into specific cuts, and packed in salt within hours of slaughter. The salt pork process was precise. Salting could be combined with smoking to produce bacon in peasant homes. The basic process involved covering the meat with salt to draw out moisture and create an environment hostile to bacteria. You learn different techniques for different cuts. Bacon was made from pork belly, cured with salt and often smoked for additional flavor and preservation. Ham was made from pork legs, dry cured with salt for months until completely preserved. Shoulder cuts were often made into salt pork for cooking. The storage requirements were specific but manageable. Salt pork needed to be kept in cool, dry conditions, protected from rodents and insects, and checked regularly for signs of spoilage. Properly prepared and stored salt pork could last for years, providing protein when fresh meat was unavailable. Medieval families often maintained barrels of salt pork as their primary protein source through winter. The meat was incredibly salty and required soaking before cooking, but it provided essential nutrients and could be used in countless recipes. Salt pork was the foundation of winter stews, bean dishes, and vegetable soups. Food number 13. Beer and ale, liquid bread that lasts. You learn that beer isn't just a drink. It's a preservation method for grains and a source of nutrition that could last for months. Before hops became popular, it was difficult to preserve this beverage for any time, so it was mostly consumed fresh. Quantities of beer consumed by medieval residents far exceeded modern intakes. Polish peasants consumed up to 3 liters per day. Medieval beer was different from modern beer. It was often unfiltered, lower in alcohol, and consumed as a daily staple rather than recreational drink. In the early Middle Ages, beer was brewed primarily in monasteries and on a smaller scale in individual households. The preservation aspect was crucial. Beer was often safer to drink than water, which could be contaminated with deadly bacteria. The brewing process killed harmful microorganisms, and the alcohol content provided additional protection against spoilage. You master basic brewing techniques using available grains. Barley was malted by soaking and allowing it to sprout, then dried and ground. The malted grain was mixed with hot water to create a sweet liquid, which was then fermented with wild yeasts or carefully maintained brewing cultures. Storage required understanding fermentation timing. Fresh beer needed to be consumed quickly, but properly fermented beer could last for months in sealed containers. Medieval brewers learned to control fermentation to create beer that would remain drinkable through winter months. The nutritional value was significant. Beer provided calories, B vitamins, and minerals from the grains used in brewing. In medieval times, beer was often called liquid bread because it provided similar nutritional benefits to bread, but in liquid form that was often safer than available water. Food number 14. Dried herbs and spices, flavor and medicine combined. You discover that dried herbs aren't just seasonings, they're preservation systems, medicines, and flavor enhancers that could last for years. Medieval households carefully dried and stored herbs that served multiple purposes throughout the year. The drying process was simple but required attention. Herbs were harvested at peak potency, bundled and hung in dry, airy places, or laid out on cloths to dry completely. Once dried, they were stored in sealed containers, protected from light and moisture. Medicinal herbs were especially important. Medieval people used dried herbs to treat everything from digestive problems to wounds to respiratory illnesses. A well-stocked herb collection was like having a pharmacy that never expired and cost nothing to maintain. Culinary herbs made preserved foods palatable. Salt pork, dried beans, and stored grains could be bland and unappetizing, but dried herbs added flavor, variety, and appeal to winter meals. Herbs like thyme, sage, rosemary, and oregano retained their flavors for years when properly dried and stored. Preservation herbs served double duty. Some herbs, like bay leaves and mint, naturally repelled insects and were used to protect other stored foods. Others, like garlic and onions, had natural antimicrobial properties that helped preserve foods they were stored with. The storage techniques were refined over generations. Dried herbs were kept in sealed pottery vessels, wooden boxes, or cloth bags, often layered with aromatic materials to maintain potency. Some herbs were ground into powders for easier storage and use. Food number 15. Wine, the liquid that improves with age. You learn that wine isn't just alcoholic grape juice. It's a preservation method that actually improves over time. Wine was believed to act as a kind of vaporizer and conduit of other foodstuffs to every part of the body. The aging of high-quality red wine required specialized knowledge as well as expensive storage and equipment. Medieval wine served multiple purposes. It was safer than water, provided calories and nutrients, served as a base for medicines, and could be stored for years without spoilage. Wine and mead could keep for months, while fermentation accelerated the preservation process. The preservation science was understood intuitively. Wine's alcohol content prevented harmful bacteria from growing, while the fermentation process created an acidic environment that further protected against spoilage. Properly made wine could last for years, often improving with age. You master basic winemaking from available fruits. Grapes were preferred, but wine could be made from apples, pears, berries, or any fermentable fruit. The fruit was crushed, fermented with wild or cultivated yeasts, and then aged in sealed containers. Storage required specific conditions. Wine needed to be kept cool, dark, and stable. Medieval wine cellars were often underground, maintaining consistent temperatures year-round. Wine containers were sealed with wax or cloth to prevent air exposure while allowing slight breathing. The medicinal aspects were crucial. Wine was used as a base for herbal medicines, as an antiseptic for wounds, and as a general tonic for health. Medieval people understood that moderate wine consumption could prevent certain illnesses and improve overall health. The psychology of survival storage. You develop a medieval mindset about food security that modern people can barely comprehend. Every meal could be your last if you haven't planned properly. Every preserved food represents survival through another winter. Every storage technique is literally a matter of life and death. Medieval peasants lived with constant awareness of their food stores. They knew exactly how much hardtack remained, how many pounds of beans were left, how long their salt pork would last. This wasn't obsessive behavior, it was rational survival planning in a world where miscalculation meant starvation. The seasonal rhythm shaped everything. Spring was planting and hope. Summer was growth and gradual optimism. Autumn was frantic preservation activity. Winter was careful rationing and prayer that your calculations were correct. The cycle repeated endlessly, and survival depended on getting it right every single time. You learn to think in terms of redundancy and diversity. No single preserved food could sustain you alone. Successful survival required 15 different preservation strategies, multiple storage locations, and constant vigilance against the countless forces trying to destroy your food stores. The legacy of medieval food wisdom. As you grow older in your medieval life, you realize that your ancestors developed food preservation techniques so effective that many are still used today. Modern preppers and survival experts study medieval methods because they work, they're affordable, and they don't depend on technology that might fail. The 15 foods you've stockpiled, hardtack, honey, salt, stockfish, beans, grains, cheese, fats, vinegar, dried fruits, nuts, salt pork, beer, herbs, and wine, represent humanity's greatest victory over hunger. These aren't just foods, they're technologies that allowed civilization to survive and thrive through countless famines, wars, and disasters. You've learned that food preservation isn't about convenience, it's about survival. Every technique, every carefully preserved jar, every dried herb represents human ingenuity applied to the most basic challenge of existence: eating tomorrow when today's food is gone. The knowledge you've gained and passed down will outlive empires. While kingdoms rise and fall, the wisdom of preserving food endures. Your descendants will use these same techniques centuries later, understanding that some knowledge is too important to be lost or forgotten. The final harvest. As you lie on your deathbed, surrounded by the food stores you've accumulated over a lifetime, you smile knowing that your family will survive the coming winter. Your granaries are full, your preservation techniques are proven, and your 15 immortal foods will sustain another generation. Outside, autumn is approaching again. Your children and grandchildren are preparing for another cycle of harvest and preservation, using the techniques you've taught them and refined through decades of experience. The endless cycle continues, but your contribution to it is complete. In a world before refrigeration, you learned that food preservation is humanity's greatest skill. You mastered 15 foods that laugh at expiration dates, developed storage techniques that outlast empires, and passed down knowledge that will sustain your family through whatever challenges the future might bring. The medieval peasant stockpile wasn't just food. It was hope, security, and survival distilled into 15 perfect preservation strategies. These foods never expired because the knowledge that created them was timeless, tested by centuries of human experience, and proven by the simple fact that we're all still here. Your legacy isn't just survival. It's the wisdom to turn temporary abundance into permanent security, one perfectly preserved food at a time.